Hello, Mitesh here, Cloud Solution Architect with LANet. In this series of videos, we're going to talk about data security in the Microsoft Public Cloud. So this is part one. We're going to focus on some of the theory in this one. So in this one, we'll talk about the security layers, the different layers at which you need to protect your data. We'll also look at some common tips and risk mitigation scenarios for common customer cases that we see out there. We'll look at access levels and architectures in this video, and in the next one we'll do a demo so you can see what it actually looks like in the cloud. Okay, so we'll look at three scenarios here. These are common scenarios that we see in public environments, even in production, where customers are opening themselves up to certain risks. So we've provided some guidance here on how to mitigate those risks. The top one that we see is users having SQL admin rights. What that means is that they can pretty much do anything on that SQL server or other databases on the same server. They can also add their own firewall rule. So for example, they could be sat in a coffee shop, add their own firewall rule, and then you've opened up public access to your SQL servers. How do you manage that? So you can use role-based access, so only grant the correct level of access, so only give them access to manage the databases, for example. Use their Azure AD logins, don't use SQL admin logins at the server level. Create the database level users using Azure AD, so you manage their identities as part of your overall identity management system. You can also use managed identities and service principals as part of Azure AD for applications rather than user accounts. Okay, the second one is to allow Azure services switched on, similar to VMs as well. We see a lot of environments where customers have left RDP ports open. So basically you're exposing, in the case of VMs, you're exposing those to the internet. Anybody can attempt to hack into your VM because anyone's got access to the public IP of it. You'll generally find about 20,000 attempts per day, and it's usually just a matter of time before somebody gets in. In terms of Azure, allow Azure services. So if we look at storage or SQL, this session and the next demo is mostly about SQL, so we'll just talk about that. What that means is that anybody in Azure can potentially have access to at least attempt login. So how do you mitigate that? So you could whitelist. If you have to come over the internet, you can whitelist IPs. So use only specific IPs that you know of, so such as your on-premises networks, for example. If you don't need to come over the internet, use service endpoints. So if all your traffic's within Azure, use service endpoints. And you can also now use something called private link. So you can set up private endpoints inside your network, and that closes off your internet access to your database. And also you can use on-prem data gateway. So that's a service or a tool that you install on your networks, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, that can then connect to your databases and then be accessed by other systems within Azure, such as Logic Apps or Power BI. Again, that requires your connection from data gateway goes out via HTTPS and you do not need to open up a public endpoint on your backend data sources. Number three, no auditing or advanced security. So you've got production environments, so you're not auditing what's going on in there, who's accessing it. Also, the advanced data security features offer you some additional protection, like things that we talked about earlier about masking and confidential data classification. So we'll look at that in one of the upcoming videos. So you don't know where your confidential data actually lives inside your databases. You don't know which fields have what classification, and you don't really have a view of who's accessing that data. So to mitigate that, you can enable these features. You can also enforce them by policy as well. So if anybody creates a server, for example, and then they don't enable them, you can enable that automatically. You could also set up your own custom reports. You can even trigger alerts on those reports depending on the type of data people are accessing. And you can also enable advanced threat detection on resources. So that gives you a list of checks that Microsoft do to look for malicious activity on that data. And you'll get alerts about that activity. Okay, so let's look at the levels of data access. If we look at here, the allow all of Azure, again, this is the one that's quite common. So that's where that switch at the bottom is actually set to on. So it's at least, it's the simplest to set up. So it, like many things in the cloud, a lot of people just switch it on and think, yep, this works, so they just leave it. Again, that's the highest risk as well. Again, so then you're moving from that, you lock that down, so you only allow specific IPs. But again, people can override that if they've got SQL admin access. So again, as I mentioned, somebody could add their own IP addresses or add a public location, click add the firewall rule, and off they go. And that stays there and keeps that public endpoint open. And then you've got service endpoint. So that limits access now from subnets within your Azure virtual networks. But it also allows access to a type of resource in a region. So that would say from machines in this network, for example, or this subnet, have got access to all storage accounts in East US or SQL servers in East US. So a user could then potentially create their own server in their own subscription in the East US region and then access that as well. So you have got a risk of data exfiltration there. So how do we tackle this? So the next level up from that would be private endpoint. So this gives us a private IP in our own internal Azure VNets. That means you can now map that IP in your internal network to a backend PaaS system such as Cosmos DB, Data Lake, SQL Server, storage accounts. That means that you access that through a private IP in your own private networks, and you can then switch off all public endpoints. You can then also access that private IP from your on-premises networks as well. So if you're using a VPN or Express Route, you can come across that, and I'll show you what that looks like next. So here's the scenarios. So allow all. So that means anyone in Azure can come in and potentially see your endpoints and then try and authenticate. Okay, so that's the least secure. And then we move to whitelisting IP addresses, as I mentioned. So you've got your network. There's a made-up IP address there. We add that IP address in the rules, and only that network can then access that. Moving on from that one, we look at service endpoints. But again, I'd say from your public networks, you're still coming across the internet to that public IP address, as we see set up above. Service endpoints are useful for your Azure network. So if you've got VMs or services inside networks, you can then use those subnets to access specific object types in a region, as I mentioned before. So that VM that we see here can access, if we have a service endpoint set up for SQL Server in West Europe, for example, this machine can access any SQL Server in West Europe. Obviously, you have to set it up on the SQL side as well to say this SQL box can receive traffic from this subnet. So you've got to do it both ways around. And also you can control that with network security groups as well. So moving on from that, we have the private endpoint. So what that means is we have a specific object inside our subnets, and that will translate the public IPs of these into internal ones inside your network. Okay, so now that gives us access to a specific instance as well. So it's not all SQL servers in West Europe anymore. It's particular SQL Server instances. So that gives you a lot more control, and that kind of is there to mitigate the data exfiltration scenario as well. If you want to connect to those from your customer networks, from your own on-premises networks, you set up your VPNs, and that can then traverse the internet via your encrypted tunnel into your private subnet here via your private endpoint and hit the instance that way. So that's great, and that's coming over the internet via an IPsec tunnel. So if you want to restrict that even further, what you would do is set up an express route, which gives you a kind of a private connection via your service provider into Azure, and that can then connect to your network and your private endpoints, and again access the specific instance. To control access to those instances in these private endpoints, you can use something called network security groups, or NSGs. It works at the layer 4 network level, so you kind of control port, protocol, source and destination. So that gives you some additional control there. All right, so in summary, we have try and control internet access. So look at the allow Azure service. Do we really need to do that? Can we limit it by using IP whitelisting? Or can we then even move down to service endpoints? So you lock it down to a specific region like this, all Azure in storage in East US 2, for example. And then can we lock it down using private endpoints? So can we lock down to specific instances? So that would be your preferred option if we can use that. So summary on the general part. Use AD role-based access to get access to resources. Try not to give out server admin credentials. And also enable some of the advanced features to classify data and enable audit and tracking. So the next video, we're going to look at what this actually looks like. So we'll walk through the public access, then we'll go into the private endpoint. We'll also look at connecting using the Bastion service. So what that gives us is access to our VMs running in Azure without opening those up as well to the internet. So the only way we get in is via the port or via HTTPS connection. Okay, then we'll connect to our private endpoint and connect to a database, and we'll also look at how to control access to who can connect to these private endpoints as well. Thanks very much for watching and sticking with me. I hope you found it useful, but subscribe to our YouTube channel so you'll see some new videos I'm going to be posting up very soon. Leave some comments if you thought it was useful, or even if you didn't. Also, follow our LinkedIn page and Twitter accounts for I'll be posting more news, demos, best practice tips and articles. And I'll see you in part 2. Thanks very much.